It was a cold morning for Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. A woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter down a street in the Lamert Park neighborhood. It was a new half-built subdivision, lots of empty lots, weeds, and construction debris. She saw something in the grass. At first, she thought it was a mannequin from a store window, one that had been broken and dumped. It was pale white and cut in half, but as she got closer, she realized it wasn't a mannequin. It was a person. She grabbed her daughter and ran to the nearest house to call the police. What the police found in that empty lot has haunted us for decades. It was the body of a young woman. She was naked. Her body had been severed at the waist with surgical precision. She had been completely drained of blood, and her skin was almost unnaturally white, as if she had been scrubbed clean. Her face was the worst part. The killer had sliced her mouth from ear to ear, creating a grotesque, permanent smile. It was a crime of shocking brutality. The woman was identified as Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She was an aspiring actress, or at least that's what people said. She drifted between jobs as a waitress, living in cheap hotels and rooming houses. She had dark hair, often wore black, and had a flower in her hair. Someone, maybe a friend or a reporter, gave her a nickname that stuck. It came from a popular movie at the time, The Blue Dahlia. They called her the Black Dahlia. And just like that, Elizabeth Short, the person, disappeared, and the Black Dahlia, the legend, was born. The question that followed, the one that's still hanging in the air all these years later, is simple. Who did this to her? And the answer, the one nobody wants to hear, is just as simple. We will almost certainly never know. The case is a ghost. It's a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and the ones we have don't fit together. The trail went cold a long time ago. All the key players are dead. The evidence is gone. All that's left is the story. And the reasons why it became an impossible case to solve are as chilling as the crime itself. The first problem was the city and the time. Los Angeles in 1947 wasn't the city we know today. It was a city in transition, booming after the war, but still deeply corrupt. The Los Angeles Police Department was a mess. It was known for brutality, incompetence, and officers who were on the take. This wasn't a modern police force with DNA labs and sophisticated profiling techniques. They worked with shoe leather, instinct, and whatever they could beat out of a suspect in a back room. They were immediately in over their heads. The sheer horror of the crime scene was a clue in itself. The body was posed. It was left in a public, yet secluded spot. It was clean. This wasn't a crime of passion, a sudden burst of rage. This was something else. The bisection was clean. A hemicorporectomy. Whoever did it likely had medical knowledge. A doctor, a surgeon, maybe a butcher, or a mortician's assistant. This narrowed the field, but it also widened it to include a whole class of professionals who are hard to investigate. But the biggest problem from the very beginning was the media. The murder of the Black Dahlia wasn't just a news story, it was a media circus, a feeding frenzy. Two newspaper giants, William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner and Norman Chandler's Los Angeles Times, were locked in a circulation war. They saw the sensational crime as their chance to sell papers, and they didn't let things like facts or police procedure get in their way. Reporters were everywhere. They were at the crime scene before it was fully secured, trampling potential evidence. They called the police department pretending to be officers to get information. They bribed cops for leads. They found Elizabeth Short's mother before the police did and tricked her into giving them details about her daughter's life, all under the guise of telling her she'd won a beauty contest. They printed rumors as facts. They turned Elizabeth into a caricature. She was a promiscuous party girl, a temptress who lured men to their doom. She was a Hollywood wannabe who got mixed up with the wrong people. None of this was necessarily true, but it made for a good story. This media storm did two terrible things. First, it contaminated the investigation. Potential witnesses were influenced by what they read in the papers. The police had to waste precious time chasing down bogus leads generated by sensational headlines. Second, it created a public panic and a morbid fascination that was impossible to control. This led to another huge problem, the confessions. In the weeks and months after the murder, more than 60 people, mostly men, confessed to killing the Black Dahlia. The police had to investigate every single one of them. It was a monumental waste of time. These were people suffering from mental illness, or desperate for attention, or alcoholics who weren't sure what they'd done the night before. One man, a 29-year-old Army corporal named Joseph DeMace, sent a note confessing. The police tracked him down and questioned him for days. He eventually admitted he had lied. This happened over and over again. It buried the real detectives under a mountain of paperwork and false trails. And then there was the killer himself. He seemed to enjoy the attention. About a week after the body was found, someone called the editor of the Examiner. The caller said he was the killer. He told the editor he was worried the police weren't making progress and that he would be sending them some of Elizabeth's belongings to prove it was him. A few days later, a package arrived at the newspaper office. It had been carefully assembled. The words were cut out from magazines and movie ads and pasted onto a piece of paper. The message read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Inside the package was a collection of Elizabeth Short's things, her birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. The entire package had been wiped clean with gasoline, destroying any potential fingerprints. This was a direct taunt to the police. The killer was smart, careful, and confident. He was playing a game. He sent a few more bizarre, rambling letters to the press, also made of cut-out words. But these clues led nowhere. The address book only pointed them to people Elizabeth already knew, people the police were already investigating. The killer gave them a puzzle, but he made sure it was unsolvable. Another massive hurdle was the victim herself, because Elizabeth Short was a difficult person to trace. She wasn't a stable person with a steady job and a permanent address. She was a drifter. She moved from city to city, state to state. In the months before her death, she had been all over Southern California. She stayed with friends, with acquaintances, with men she had just met. She rarely stayed in one place for more than a few days. This made creating a timeline of her final weeks a nightmare for investigators. There was a whole period, about a week long, right before her murder, that became known as her missing week. The last time anyone saw her for sure was on January 9th at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She was dropped off there by a man she'd been dating, a married salesman named Robert Red Manley. He said she was going to meet her sister, but her sister wasn't in Los Angeles. After Manley left, Elizabeth Short essentially vanished. Where did she go? Who was she with? No one knows. The trail just goes cold. Whoever killed her was likely someone she met during that week. Someone who wasn't in her address book. Someone none of her friends or family knew about. This is a classic dead end in a murder investigation. The victim's world is the first place you look for suspects. But what if the killer wasn't part of her known world? What if he was a stranger or a new acquaintance she trusted for a night? The police had nothing to go on. And perhaps the most critical failure of all, they never found the crime scene. Elizabeth Short was not killed in that empty lot. She was killed somewhere else, indoors, and then her body was brought there and dumped. The police knew this because of the condition of the body. It had been washed clean. There was no blood at the scene. This means the real crime scene. The place where all the forensic evidence would be: blood, fibers, fingerprints. The murder weapon was never found. Without a crime scene, the police were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. They had a victim, but they had no location, no context for the murder. It was as if it happened in a vacuum. So, you have a corrupt and overwhelmed police force. You have a media frenzy creating chaos and false leads. You have a flood of fake confessions. You have a victim with a transient lifestyle and a missing week. You have a killer who is intelligent, careful, and taunts the police from the shadows. And you have no primary crime scene. You put all of that together, and you don't have a mystery. You have an impossible situation. The investigation was doomed from the start. Over the years, the case file grew to be enormous. The Lap Dead interviewed thousands of people. They considered hundreds of potential suspects. The list of suspects is a wild collection of people, from doctors and gangsters to famous artists. But they never had enough evidence to charge a single person with the murder of Elizabeth Short. Let's talk about some of those suspects, because they are the heart of the modern obsession with the case. There have been dozens, but a few stand out as the most compelling, or at least the most famous. One of the earliest and most prominent suspects was Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub and movie theater owner. His name was on the address book the killer sent to the press. Elizabeth Short had stayed at his home for a short period with a group of other young women. The theory was that Hansen was obsessed with her, she rejected his advances, and he flew into a rage. He had connections, he had power, he certainly had a motive. The police investigated him thoroughly. They searched his home, but they found nothing. He had an alibi, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. He was a good suspect on paper, but that was it. Then there was Walter Bailey. He was a surgeon who lived just one block from the empty lot where the body was found. This immediately made him a person of interest. The bisection of the body was so precise that many believed only a surgeon could have done it. Bailey's own daughter later came forward and said she believed her father was the killer. She claimed he had a deteriorating mental state and a dark side. The timeline was suspicious. Shortly after the murder, his wife died, and he checked himself into a mental hospital. But again, it was all circumstantial. There was no hard proof. Bailey died in 1948, taking any secrets he might have had to his grave. Another intriguing character was Leslie Dillon. He was a bellhop and an aspiring writer who contacted a psychiatrist named Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, who was consulting on the case. Dillon seemed to know an incredible amount of detail about the murder, things that hadn't been released to the public. He claimed he was writing a book about a perfect crime based on the Dahlia case. and that he had gotten information from a friend named Al Morrison. The police became convinced that either Dylan or his friend was the killer. They held Dylan in a hotel room for days, questioning him relentlessly, but they couldn't break him. They couldn't find his supposed friend Al Morrison, and they couldn't find any evidence to hold him. His knowledge was suspicious, but it wasn't proof of murder. He was eventually let go. But today, the suspect who gets the most attention by far is a man named Dr. George Hodel. This Hodel was a brilliant and sinister figure. He was a prominent Los Angeles doctor who specialized in venereal diseases. He had a genius-level IQ. He was also a surrealist artist and part of the avant-garde scene, friends with people like the artist Man Ray and the director John Huston. And he had a very dark side. He was accused by his own daughter Tamar of sexual abuse, though he was acquitted in a sensational trial. The theory that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia killer comes from his own son, Steve Hodel. Steve grew up to become a homicide detective for the Lap Dad. After he retired, he started going through his late father's belongings. He found a small photo album. Inside were 2 pictures of a dark-haired woman. Steve became convinced that the woman was Elizabeth Short. This started him on a 2-decade-long investigation into his own father. The case Steve Hodel builds is chilling and extensive. He argues that his father had the surgical skill to perform the bisection. He had the motive, a sadistic psychopathy. He had the means and opportunity. The Hodel family home, a unique building designed by Lloyd Wright, was, according to Steve, the murder scene. Years later, he brought a cadaver dog to the house, and the dog alerted in several spots in the basement, indicating the possible scent of human decomposition. Soil samples from the backyard were also analyzed and found to be consistent with soil from the lot where the body was dumped. Steve Hodel also uncovered FBI files that showed his father was a prime suspect in the Dahlia case back in the late 1940s. The Lap Dad had bugged his house. In the transcripts of those recordings, George Hodel can be heard talking to himself. He says things like, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." He also seems to be discussing paying off police officers. The Lapties suddenly dropped their surveillance of Hodel right after these conversations. Did he bribe someone? Did they realize they didn't have enough to charge him? We don't know. Shortly after, George Hodel left the country and lived in Asia for decades. Steve Hodel believes his father was a serial killer, responsible not just for the Dahlia murder, but for several other unsolved killings in Los Angeles, and even the lipstick murders in Chicago. He even makes a compelling case that the handwriting on some of the killer's taunting notes matches his father's. It's a powerful story, and many people who have studied the case believe Steve Hodel has solved it. But even with all this, it's not a closed case. Not officially. Most of the evidence is circumstantial. The photographs of the woman in the album are not definitively Elizabeth Short. The cadaver dog and soil sample evidence is compelling, but it's not definitive proof you could use in court today. The bugged conversations are damning, but they aren't a confession. George Hodel is dead. We can't question him. We can't put him on trial. So even the strongest suspect theory remains just that, a theory. It's the best answer we have, but it's not the answer. So why are we still so obsessed? Why does this one unsolved murder from the 1940s still capture our imagination when so many others are forgotten? Well, I think there are a few reasons. First, it's the nature of the crime itself. It's so cinematic. You have this beautiful, tragic victim, a young woman who came to Hollywood with dreams in her eyes. You have a setting, post-war Los Angeles. That feels like something out of a film noir movie. And you have a killer who is a ghost, a brilliant and sadistic phantom who vanished without a trace. It's a perfect dark story. James Ellroy wrote a famous novel about it. There have been movies and TV shows. The story is just too good to let go. Second, Elizabeth Short has become a blank slate. Because we know so little about her real life, and because her life was so chaotic, she's become a symbol. She represents the dark side of the Hollywood dream. She's a cautionary tale about the pretty girl who comes to the big city and gets chewed up and spit out. People project all sorts of fantasies and fears onto her. She's not a real person anymore, she's a myth. And myths are powerful. And finally, I think we're obsessed with it because it's unsolved. Human beings hate a mystery without a solution. We need closure. We want the bad guy to be caught and the story to have an ending. The Black Dahlia case offers no closure. It's a permanent cliffhanger. It's an open wound on the history of Los Angeles. And that void pulls us in. We try to fill it with our own theories. We read the books, we watch the documentaries, we argue about the suspects online. We become detectives ourselves, trying to solve the impossible case from our armchairs. Will we ever know for sure who killed her? The answer has to be no. It's been too long. The people who knew the truth are all gone. The physical evidence that could give us a definitive answer, like DNA, was never collected or has long since degraded. The Lapties' original case files are massive, but they are a confusing mess of dead ends and rumors. Some people even believe that many of the original files have disappeared, possibly to protect powerful people who were involved. All we have is the story. The story of Betty Bersinger finding what she thought was a mannequin. The story of the reporters at the Examiner tricking a grieving mother. The story of a package filled with gasoline-scented memories. The story of a doctor's son who believes his own father was a monster. It's a collection of fragments of possibilities. And George Hodel is the most likely suspect, the one that makes the most sense. But likely isn't the same as certain, and so the case remains officially open and officially unsolved. In the end, the most tragic part of the whole story is that the person at the center of it is lost. Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old woman from Massachusetts who liked movies and had a bad tooth that made her smile self-conscious. And she was a daughter and a sister. She had hopes and fears. But that person is buried under the weight of the Black Dahlia myth. She's not a person anymore. She's a puzzle. And it's a puzzle that will likely torment and fascinate us forever. A dark Hollywood ghost story with the final page torn out. We'll never get to read it, we'll never know how it ends.